Hey, everybody, and welcome to an all new, exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. I am glad to be talking on this episode with comics creator Mike Manley. Mike, thank you for jumping on, taking some time to talk with me, and thank you also for the lovely art in the background. I'm enjoying that way back there, so appreciating the atmosphere.
Yeah, it's very apt to have Gotham City as
Yes, yeah.
yes, yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, as I was saying, I typically do like a bookshelf background, but I had this up because I just did a podcast where someone was interviewing me. But you're a person who's worked in the animated world of Bruce Timm and the series kind of work as well as the comics, and so I thought this would be a great sort of appropriate background to have. Plus, it just makes me feel like I fit into this background, so it works. So I'll mention at the top of the episode a couple of names of some characters that you've worked on and some work that I love, and then we can talk about your path and the things that you love as well. So the Phantom currently the Phantom, being the I love the tagline that's on the comics website, which is before there was Batman, before there was the Shadow, like yeah, there was the Phantom that goes to walk. So love that. You've also had a hand in Marvel Comics with Darkhawk being one of those.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and also Night's End. So being a
Night's End,
big.
Night's End and then Night Quest, I
Hmm.
believe. After
Hmm.
yeah. Nightfall, Night's End and or Night Quest and then Night's End. It was like all the nights.
Yes, yeah, and such an epic time for the Batman character. Such a great part of that series as well. I think I had a through some like through the mail order company thing. I had a comic that was signed by you that had like a certificate of authenticity and all that kind of stuff, and it was one of the Knights End comics with your signature on it. So good memories of that, very good memories of that. And then of course you have Superman Adventures, the Batman and Superman Adventures, and you also worked on the television show doing animation work as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I started first I started on Superman as a storyboard artist
Yeah. Yeah.
1996. And then they decided to bring back Batman,
Hmm.
and then I worked on so I storyboarded on that, and then I moved in. But usually, what happens in animation is they do the storyboards come in first, and then after that, there's a lot of other things that happen, like background designs and things like that.
Hmm.
Key backgrounds to give to the storyboard people to start, but then there's a lot of additional work that's done after the storyboards are done. And so in between seasons, I would do background design. So I did
Nice.
background design on some Superman, some Batman, and then on Batman Beyond.
Oh, nice, nice. Yeah. I love that whole world of the animated sort of approach. And I think I was talking with someone and they said it's the version of Batman that lives most in my mind. And I think I'm right there with them. I mean, it's right up there. Batman, Superman, and all of those characters. And it's such a nice design. And I learned about so many characters through that series too. Lots of characters from the comics that I really was not as familiar with. And of course, some new characters that were created for the show. And
Right. Yeah. I think the thing that I enjoyed the most about it, honestly, was that they got to cherry pick
Mhm,
from the history of both characters.
mhm, mhm.
Um, and because you have 22 minutes to tell a story, um, everything was really buttoned down, which
Oh,
was very different than my experience on like Nightfall working on Batman in the comics because at that point was actually the beginning of the whole hive mind way of doing what Marvel and DC started doing, which is they would have a conference and then they would spend these big, long, epic storylines that might, include like every Batman title, but also other titles.
Hmm. Hmm.
So you, you were like slotted in. You get this chapter. This person gets this chapter. This person gets this chapter. This person gets. So you weren't. It wasn't really as. It was very different than the Batman comics I read
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
kid. You had like the Raza School, uh, and you would have like 3 or 4 issues in a row. But then that would be it,
Hmm.
And Detective was different than Batman,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And Batman Family or whatever was different than it was. So you had a different flavor with each book, which is something that's really sort of missing now in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I really loved working in animation, which is actually something that I always wanted to do, even as when I was a teenager.
Hmm.
I wanted to work in animation, but growing up in Detroit or growing up in Ann Arbor, I mean, the whole world is so different now
Yeah.
from when I was 17, 15, 16, 17, going to conventions. There was Cal Arts, there was Art Center, there were a few places that taught animation, and then you still had Disney. Uh, Hanna Barbera actually had a trainee program,
Huh.
uh, and I remember attempting to find out information about that and trying to get in. And I talked to some like bitter old animator who I got this number for the uh, Hanna Barbera trainee program, and I
Mm.
called him up, and he's like, "Oh, you don't want to work in animation, kid. It's a shit." He's like, "Oh, okay." So that was probably like 1980. So 15 years, 16 years later, I ended up working in animation, and I actually
Mm.
left comics to go into animation, and I worked in animation full time for several years. Again, working with Bruce and Paul and all those guys on Superman and Batman.
Hmm.
But then moving over and working on Samurai Jack,
Nice. Nice.
Venture,
Yeah.
Venture Brothers, Fairly Odd Parents. I sort of jumped around and got to do a lot of different things to sort of express the other side of my interest, which sometimes was like humor, but
Hmm.
which I never really got to express in comics outside of me doing my own self-published projects with Action Planet,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
is what led me to meeting Bruce and him asking me if I was interested in trying out on storyboards. So it's funny how things kind of come back around
Yeah.
because comics kind of typecasts you. Like
Hmm.
you're a grim guy or you're a funny person. Um,
Uh,
at least at that time, because comics was really changing quite a bit in the late '80s, early '90s.
hmm.
Then Image came in. Comics kind of blew up, and then blew up.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
which is one of the reasons why I left Batman, and then soon after tried to self-publish, and then soon after that, when I had the opportunity to go into animation, I left comics because I could sort of see like you were going, we're we were sliding down the hill,
Hmm. Hmm.
pretty fast.
Yeah. Yeah. The 90s started with this very, like you said, it blew up. There was that boom. And then there was so much there. Um,
You know what
and
really kind of blew it up was the death of Superman blew up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then the rebirth of Superman blew a lot of stores up. I knew a guy in South Philly that thought like, well, I got caught flat-footed with the death of Superman. So when Superman comes back, I'm gonna, buy, 20 boxes of.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, none of that was during the Wizard speculation, and all
Mm-hmm.
that stuff was going on, which had nothing to do with the craft of
Mm-hmm.
comics.
Mm-hmm.
It had all to do with all the speculation, like that book you had, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
With my signature. Like one day I signed 5,000 comics for the QVC,
Yes. Uh-huh.
right? And so they were doing a lot of stuff like that where they were saying, you buy this comic, you have the certificate of authenticity, which, like, who validates that? I don't know. It's not like the state board of regents who get together and all compare things. So a lot of people kind of got caught flat-footed,
Mm-hmm.
and you also had like pogs going on, and
Yes.
baseball
Yeah.
cards and hockey cards. All the
Mm-hmm.
stuff was going on, and then like it kind of sucked the air all out at one time. And
Yeah.
there was also a lot of pressure, I think, on you as an artist working at that time, uh, to work in certain ways, do certain kinds of stories. I mean, like,
Mm-hmm.
if you were buying comics, you're like, I imagine you're like late 30s, early 40s,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep. Yep.
Right.
Spot on. Yep.
Right. So most of my fans are your age,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And you guys were the last generation of people to come in, collect comics, then go collect back issues, come into the conventions with your backpack or your
Yeah.
little cart with stuff you wanted to get signed, stuff you wanted to, pull list, stuff you wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see that now. You don't see that. All kind of went away with your guys' generation. You guys are the last generation. Just like
Gotcha.
the business also changed when it went from newsstand
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
just comic book stores,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So a lot of things change that have an effect upon you as an artist in the business, but not necessarily pertaining to your craft. There's all these
Mm-hmm.
outside forces that affect things. Marvel Comics went bankrupt,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Which was, I mean, just wild to have that happen right on the tail end of all of that.
Right. And that all the people that I came into the business, got to know, worked with, those people were all fired. Most of them,
Mm.
99% of them were fired. And one of the things that was the result of that is when those people are gone, your history with the company is gone,
Wow. Yeah.
right? Like nobody
Mm-hmm.
is there anymore that remembers you saved their ass on some issue of Spider-Man,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? Or, the new editor coming in may not be familiar with your work.
Yeah.
And that increasingly happened over the course of the last 15 or 20 years.
Mm.
So, it was the first the first 10 years of my career were very different than the second 10 years of my career.
Mm-hmm.
My first 10 years of my career were pretty much like what comics had sort of been,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? That was before computers and all that stuff, right? I remember when I got a fax machine, it was like, oh, we're faxing stuff now, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No longer through the mail, sending pages and stuff.
And FedEx, right? So now nobody goes to FedEx. I mean, I remember all through the 80s and the early, through the Batman years,
Mm-hmm.
racing to FedEx, right? Because nobody was scanning stuff on your computer and mailing it or anything like that. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it was a very different era. And then the computer came in, and that also started to change the artwork and your responsibility in your process.
Hmm. Yeah. I can, yeah, you've seen a lot through the course of what you've done in comics. Lots of change.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like I said, the first 10 years were paper, pencils,
Hmm.
ink. You'd go up, you drop stuff off, you mail it in, drop stuff off, you pick up your script, you come back home. Marvel made their own paper, DC made their own paper. They made two types of paper, three types of paper. They gave you the paper. It was just very, it was a very different, and that, and then the 80s for a while, I shared Al Williamson's studio. And so it was pretty much like the way he worked, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
it was the same way. But then once the technology came in, it really started changing things quite a bit.
So how does the Phantom come to be at this point, and kind of what you're working on now and exploring?
Well, the Phantom happened as a result of me already working for King Features.
Hmm. Okay.
In 2010, I started doing Judge Parker, which is a long time running classic soap opera comic strip.
Hmm.
And I ended up getting that gig because I had done uh, two issues, two stories of Secret Agent Corrigan, which is the character that Al Williamson did. The King Features was doing new stories for Egmont, a publisher in Europe. And at that time, Brendan Burford, who was the editor, contacted me to see if I would be interested in doing those two stories, which I was, and I did. And then when Eduardo Barreto became sick, he thought of me as to fill in for
Hmm.
Barreto. But unfortunately, Barreto passed away. So I ended up doing Judge Parker. The same thing happened like 7 years ago when Paul Ryan passed away suddenly.
Hmm.
But since I was already working for them, they were like, "Hey, are you interested?" Just like if I croak today, they'll find somebody within a period of a week or two to do the Phantom because that's the way newspaper strips are. With legacy strips, they
Hmm.
have to find somebody right away to do it because if they go to reprint, they would probably lose their client papers who would say, "Hey, I'm not paying for reprints."
Yeah.
So that's how that happened, and then I think I am the seventh or eighth artist who worked on Batman, but also the Phantom. Joe Giello, who just
Nice.
passed away last year, he worked on it. Graham Nolan worked on him.
Mm.
Uh, uh, there's a whole bunch of artists. If you go back, Cy Berry, a whole bunch of artists going back into the 50s who at one point worked on Batman, but then also worked on the Phantom.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't imagine you're running to FedEx anymore with Phantom.
No, no. I mean, I will. I send everything. I actually last year, especially, I've been working digitally, and because of COVID and everything, kind of really
Mm-hmm.
screwed everything up. So originally, I had my assistant would come over, and I would lay stuff out, and then she would pencil the backgrounds, and then once I would pencil the figures, and then I would ink the figures, and she would ink the backgrounds, and I was actually doing it on paper. Um, but then COVID came.
Hmm.
No, no, nobody's coming over. Uh, for a while, I was still actually penciling it on paper because I like drawing on paper, and then we would digitally ink it. But uh, just because I'm so pressed for time and everything, I've actually moved to working completely digital on the Phantom. I've been digital for about 5 years on Judge Parker. Um, and so it's a different experience. I was sort of hesitant to do it in the beginning
Yeah.
because I love paper. I love working traditionally, but you know, the fact is that you have to be able to adapt to technology as an illustrator, right?
Yeah.
You don't
Yeah.
get to dictate to the client how the client wants to receive the work.
Right. Right.
So even before, when I was working traditionally, I'd have to scan, I'd ink it, scan it in, and then I would have to make sure that it was shrunk down and I'd have a template, put into the template at the right size and the right DPI to send to King Features.
Mm.
Because what they do is they take all the files and they make a PDF and they send the PDF to every paper that has the Phantom.
Yeah.
When I started on Judge Parker, they made paper stats of everything
Yeah.
and sent the paper stats, the paper proofs out. I have some somewhere. But probably 10 years ago, they stopped doing that. 7, 10 years or somewhere there, they stopped doing that because it's like if you sent it to the newspaper, then the newspaper has to take it and scan it,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So like nobody wants to scan anything anymore, right?
Yeah.
So like the last several jobs I did for Marvel or DC, I scan it, I put it in a template, and I send it to them. Nobody. They don't even have a bullpen
Mm.
anymore. They don't have the bullpen like they used to, which is sort of a sorry thing because one of the things about that old way of working was, and nobody goes into the offices. So
Mm-hmm.
you could go up into the office, you could meet work, you could meet another artist,
Yeah.
you could go see John Romita, or if you were having a discussion about a cover layout, you and the editor could go down and talk to John Romita, or you could pick up work. You could see somebody else working.
Mm-hmm.
It was a way of really learning, being able to pick up craft and be able to meet your fellow cartoonists.
Yeah. Yeah.
Knowledge transfer, an opportunity to transfer information and experience. And it's a little bit different when you do it in person than if you do it over like this, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I do a lot of that. I do a lot of that, but it's different if you have a piece of paper and you have a piece of tracing paper and you live go over or you draw something.
Yeah.
It's very different. So I technology is great on one hand, but then you also lose things on the other hand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Were there especially positive people that sort of mentored you or that you connected with and in that community and got the chance to work with?
Well, yes. I mean, I would say the the best experience was getting to become friends with Al Williamson
Mm-hmm.
and working in his studio for. Uh, I was there solid for like over a year, but I went up and I would come up and hang out and work because my best friend Brett Blevins had moved up and was working with Al. So I had a table, Brett had a table because Al had like a carriage house that he converted. So that was a great thing because Al was a great guy, had the most fantastic collection of comic strip art ever on
Mm-hmm.
top of his own work. And I used to spend, especially in the beginning, like every night in his studio, literally looking and studying at stuff until like my brain was like so full I couldn't contain anything anymore. And that sort of changed the course of my career because there was an issue of Daredevil because he was inking Daredevil over John Romita at the time.
Mm-hmm.
There was a fill-in issue of Daredevil, drawn by Steve Ditko,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And at that point, Ditko was doing what they would call breakdowns, which are like loose structural pencils, no black, no shade, no rendering, And when Al got it, he was like, it's like it looks a little too loose for me. Because when Al did his own work, he penciled everything very completely.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I said, well, don't send it back. I'll tighten up the pencils.
Nice. Yeah.
So what I did was I got out my Ditko and especially my Wally Wood Daredevil comics. Went over Ditko's pencils. You can see some of it on my blog and on my Twitter. I
Mm.
tightened them up, and then Al and I inked the job together. Me
Wow.
probably doing about 65, maybe 70%. Al would like choose whatever you want to ink, and then and so that showing that to Carl Potts.
Hmm.
Carl
Hmm.
Potts was like, "Wow, this is really cool." I ended up getting a regular inking gig on Alpha Flight, and then that was it.
Nice. Nice.
Everything was just like regular after that. Because I had worked on like Conan the King before
Hmm.
with Judy Hunt, um, but that didn't necessarily lead to other regular comic stuff because there was sort of this weird thing where some editors felt like, in fact, I even had one editor tell me, working on Conan or working on war books was kind of not like working in comics because it's not continuity.
Hmm.
Spider-Man is continuity.
Hmm.
Conan is not continuity,
Huh.
right? Although Conan is probably harder to draw than Spider-Man because you got to draw horses and all kinds of stuff like that, right?
Uh-huh.
And he
Uh-huh.
sort of like the only person who could really get away with that was John Buscema, right? So you know, again, it's like if you did a humor book, well, that's not considered as cool as being Spider-Man. So even within the business, there was sort of like a strata.
Oh,
So
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, so getting to know Al and become friends with Al was a great thing. And then my friend Ricardo Villagran, fantastic artist. I got to be friends with him, and when he was in the States, he would like live with me. So he would stay here.
Hmm.
Getting to see him work, getting to see him draw. He could draw, he could paint, he could do that guy could do anything. So I learned, and Al was a funny guy because Ricardo was more technical. So if you asked him, how do you do something like blonde hair?
Hmm.
He would say, this. Al was like a feeling guy.
Ah.
So he couldn't tell you technically how to do something. But if you watched him,
Hmm.
you could learn. You could
Yeah.
watch him or you study, you could learn. So, which is sort of the way, again, comics was always done because you had people who were assistants who
Hmm.
inked backgrounds or penciled backgrounds. And you would see what the master or the chief artist would do. And then you would do some of that and you would pick it up, right? And then eventually, like Wally Wood had a lot of assistants over the years who learned how to ink, how to pencil, who eventually then went on to do their own work.
Hmm.
Right? And that was the way this profession was. There were no things like the Kubert School or whatever until Joe
Right.
started doing it, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And now, of course, there's a whole gigantic industry of how to do comics, right? Guys
Yeah.
inking stuff, drawing people, drawing stuff, inking stuff. You go on YouTube and it's like hours and hours and
Oh,
hours.
yeah.
You know, not
Yeah.
all of it's good, but when you're a kid, it's like the magic show.
Well, as you said, nothing like, I'm sure, learning with the artist right there in front of you, talking through and asking questions and tailoring that way.
Yeah, yeah. I remember the first time I met Dick Giordano, he told me that if you can draw faces and hands well,
Hmm.
you will always be able to find work because those are the two hardest things to do for an artist.
Hmm.
Which is very true.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
um, there's a bunch of people who can draw muscles, but not every job you're going to get is going to require you to draw muscles,
Right.
right? Just
Yeah.
like you've been working on in the animation world, we're sort of all working in Bruce's style or whatever style of the show you're working on. So if you can really only do that sort of like say image style, well, that doesn't really apply to that kind of work. So
Hmm.
you have to be very flexible.
Yeah. Yeah. But you were talking about that link to animation. I think that's how I got introduced to the Phantom. Was the like the old Defenders cartoons?
Oh, Defenders of the Earth or whatever it was called.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That one.
I've
Yeah.
never seen that, but I've seen pictures of it.
Yeah. It's been a while, but yeah, animation, film, comics all kind of lived inside my mind. And you mentioned Alpha Flight, which also has a special place in my heart because I think I was reading Alpha Flight before I even discovered like the main Avengers team. West Coast Avengers was out there, but I think Alpha Flight was one that I picked up on prior to even the big sort of like tent pole, Iron Man, Thor, Avengers team.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that Marvel was doing right for a while was they were introducing 12 new books a year.
Hmm. Hmm.
Starbrand was one, or like Darkhawk was one, Quasar was one, and whatever, some things come out and then, 10 issues later they're canceled.
Yeah.
Um, but then some stuff stuck. And so, again, like guys, readers, fans of your generation
Hmm.
were the right spot to come in and like, oh, you could get your number one of Alpha Flight, you could get your number one of Darkhawk, you could get and you could start out. And I mean, I've had this conversation, numerous times with fans, and that was sort of a big thing to start out with something that like that's your
Hmm.
Fantastic Four number one, or
Yeah.
which is kind of lost now. I think a lot of that stuff has really been lost. And there's so many comics, and also the kids that are reading comics now or reading web comics, they're not reading Marvel, they're not reading DC. They're
Hmm.
reading comics. Comics are still really popular, but you're not getting what we call the feeder bands. There used to be a feeder band every 3 or 4 years. Another 8, 9, 10 year old would come in, read
Hmm.
comics for 3 or 4 years, and then get into cars or girls or whatever, right? But that was
Right.
the cycle forever. But that became broken. And now the people that are coming in, and I know this from teaching, the people coming in are not reading Batman,
Hmm.
right? They're not reading Spider-Man. They're reading what they can get on the computer. They're reading what they get on YouTube,
Yeah.
right? They're not even, they're reading mostly manga and mostly webtoons because it's free.
Hmm. Hmm.
They're not going to spend $5 for a Batman comic book,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
that's also changed a lot of things.
Absolutely. And welcome back. So you were talking about how people aren't paying $5 for Batman comics, and um, just wondering what you think might be next and what might be coming up in the comics world.
Well, I think we're in a time where there's a lot of things coming to a head all at one time,
Hmm.
right? So yesterday the actors went on strike with the writers, right?
Hmm.
Uh, every artist I know in the last 6 months, a year, everybody's upset about AI.
Hmm.
Uh, we're really seeing a transition from really, in a way, a sort of a final passing away of the analog world and the 20th century, and what was popular and ways of working newspapers, print, all the things that were dominant in the 20th century are really finally kind of crumbling in a
Hmm.
way with
Hmm.
in the 21st century. So in the case of illustration, obviously AI, animation, AI is going to have a devastating blow. I think for the time being, comics, as far as a computer being able to do what I do,
Hmm.
I don't think that it can. If you drew something in a sort of a Family Guy or what I call a stamp style, where it's like the same thing,
Hmm.
it might be able to do that, but it can't do Jack Kirby. It can't
No.
do Neil Adams, right?
Mm-mm.
It can't do Alex Ross. It can't act. It can make an image, but
Hmm.
it can't act. It also can't interpret a script. Because one of the things I do that's different than anybody else, if you give me a 7-page script, it could be the same story, but if 10 people draw it, each one's going to be a little bit different.
Yep. True. Very true.
Right. Right. And so I think that it cannot do. It may
Hmm.
never be able to do in the way that a human can do it. Because when the script goes through my brain, it goes through all my influences,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? All my life, it goes right through my computer banks, my what I call my artistic engine, and it comes down and it comes out,
Yeah.
right? That's and maybe next Tuesday I would make a different decision than I make today,
True.
right? But I think a lot of things like that background, it
Hmm.
could do that. It could do that background,
Yeah.
right? The
Yeah.
background behind you, it could do that background. I think there's a lot of things that it can't do. Um, but the other thing is when a fan buys a comic, they're also investing in their taste and that creator. So if you like John Byrne, you like Jim Lee, or you like Alex Ross,
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
right? That's different than just saying, I'm going to the store and getting a can of Batman,
Yeah. Very
right?
true. Well said. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but I do think there's a lot of downward pressure upon the business. The direct market is dying and is only being kept alive as long as Warner Brothers, Disney decides that they're going to continue to do print comics. And
Mm.
obviously, in the time we live, you know, the bloom is off the rose. The movies are not selling. The TV shows are not as popular.
Yeah.
The book companies have a lot of debt. There's a lot of things that can impact, like personally, I don't think Disney will keep Marvel. They'll keep Marvel, but I think it is very likely that what they will do is what they do with their characters in Mexico and in Europe. They're still Disney comics in Mexico, and these guys in Italy, and they draw fantastic.
Hmm. Hmm.
Miles and Donald Duck, Topolino, and they draw amazing stuff, but it's through another publisher. So they would license out Marvel and get somebody else to do the labor.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, and I think that that is more likely every day
Yeah.
because again, a little aside, I don't know even if you know this, but there's a Spider Verse comic book put out by Scholastic that's based upon the Miles Morales Spider Man.
Hmm.
That book outsells Marvel's Spider Man comic by quite a bit.
Oh, wow. Huh.
So all those middle grade, young adult graphic novels are going like hotcakes. Dogman,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know, Captain Underpants, Dave Pilkey, those guys, they got a million readers, right? And the kids just gobble the stuff up and they can't wait for the next one. Um, But I don't think. And then the other difference is, and this is something I observed from teaching. Our school is probably at least 60, sometimes 70% female.
Mm-hmm.
Most of There's a lot more women going into animation than men, I think, at this point.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of women coming into comics, but they're not interested in drawing Spider-Man. They're not interested in drawing Batman. They're interested in drawing different types of stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you see the dominance of manga and anime, there's a lot of different types of stories, not just teenage male power fantasies or
Mm-hmm.
regurgitated pulp. As much as I love that stuff,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, so I think comics will be around, but whether this direct market, I mean, look at what Image does. Most of what Image does is not superheroes now,
True. Yeah.
right? I mean, I guess Todd still does Spawn and Eric still does Dragon, obviously, but
Mm-hmm.
most of the other guys stopped,
Yeah.
right? And so most of the other stuff that comes out of Image is actually, I don't think you really would say it was spandex. It's not
True.
capes.
True. Lots of fantasy, lots of sci-fi, slice of life. Yeah.
So I think um, we're in a very interesting time. The problem is that the distribution is poor, uh, difficult, and there doesn't seem to be anyone investing in growing the market. They're
Mm-hmm.
harvesting the idea, the IP, but they're not then putting money back into the farm, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They take the crop, but they're not coming back and they're not investing. And I think that long term, if you don't invest, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it could happen overnight. It could literally happen overnight. Somebody decides, you know, looking at this sheet of paper, nah, we're going to go down to 4 books.
Right. Yeah.
You know, I mean, because technically, when I started in 1984, if your comic sold less than 75,000 copies, it was canceled.
Mm.
That would cancel 99% of the comics in the direct market that are being published today.
Wow.
So, the books are what, 2 or 3 times as expensive,
Mm-hmm.
but the average comic probably sells what, less than 30,000 copies, easy, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So there's a lot of different economics going on, and one of the ways that they were keeping the air in the tires was to collect things. They put out 6 issues, collected 6 issues, collected 6 issues, which is, I think, one of the reasons why you don't see anyone last on a book. Like, I
Mm.
did 25 issues of Darkhawk. I did 27 issues of Shazam and 27 issues of Alpha Flight.
Mm-hmm.
Besides Eric Larson, I don't know anybody that's, or maybe if you own your own character, it's your own character. I
Yeah.
don't know anybody that's doing 30 straight issues of anything anymore, which is what everybody wanted in the old days, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm very surprised sometimes when I see a run from a creator and thinking about Batman in particular or something like that. And it seems like it's not overnight, but to me, being a longtime reader, it seems like overnight, oh, somebody else is doing that book now. Oh, somebody else is doing this. So there is that changing of hands a good bit that happens.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's also, you can keep the graphic novels coming out, being
Hmm.
repackaged. As I understand it, the comics are like the floppies are like loss leader. You hope you don't lose or lose too much, so that
Hmm.
you can recoup it when you get the graphic novels. Because I forget, there's like several 100,000 libraries in the United States. It's like a crazy number of libraries.
Hmm.
Every one of those libraries orders a copy of your book,
It's a nice
right?
thing. Yeah.
Right, right. So there's that whole other side to comics that most people working in the direct market don't even really pay any attention to.
Hmm.
Don't really think about it. But I know for a fact that if that's how Jeff Smith keeps going. That's how a lot of people keep going. Those libraries. I always use Dave Pilkey, the Dogman guy.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
they don't order one. They might probably order three or four,
Hmm.
because otherwise, if they ordered one, it would always be checked out. So when some kid would come in, that wanted to read it, they wouldn't have it. So
Yeah.
they order multiple copies, and then if they get viewed too much, you got to order another one because they get a little doggy.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think the medium of comics will be fine. I think the the how and the where and the why
Hmm. Hmm.
will change.
That's the I've asked that question a couple of times, and I have to say I think that's the most insightful answer I've received to that question of thinking
No,
about what's next. Yeah, I appreciate that. And yeah, it's interesting to think about. And what you were saying about AI, I'm not a person who fears technology. At the same time, I'm all about continuing the vision of the artist. And I really appreciated what you were saying there about computers just not capturing some of that voice. And, that's part of what I enjoy so much about comics is you get a story, you get a visual style, you get the combination of the author and artist. Sometimes they're the same person, sometimes they're not. And there's something that is unique that comes out of that.
right. I mean, right now there's a big lawsuit going on. I've been talking to some people in the last week. They had that congressional hearing in Washington about AI.
Hmm.
Sarah Scribbles is suing them because she has a very simple cartoon style, which could be easily replicated,
Hmm.
and somebody could make their own version and have been making their own version
Oh, wow.
of that. Right. So the simpler the style, like a Simpsons or something, is much easier for a uh, computer program to imitate that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Imitate it enough that the consumer will be satisfied. Because we live in this meme culture now where, to me, the thing that will decide the battle in Hollywood is whether the consumer will be satisfied with, if the studios win,
Hmm.
the regurgitation, because it doesn't make anything. It only makes combinations of what it has.
Yeah.
So it's like this big salad that it's chopped all these images, all this stuff up, and then it just kind of rearranges. But there's nothing new because it's not making anything new. It's just
Hmm.
rearranging things. Will the consumer who loves Star Trek say, I'm willing to watch the fifth season of Strange New Worlds and it's all AI? We got rid of all the people, you
Hmm.
know.
Hmm.
Um, going forward, are you going to be happy if Baby Yoda is not a puppet anymore? It's just like a AI thing, right? Because
Hmm.
studios would love to have that genie where they can just go, uh, 17 prompts and I have a season of a show,
Right.
right? We get a couple young kids from USC Film School starving to punch up the scripts a little bit from our notes.
Hmm.
Um, it's whether the people consuming this actually value what I do, what you do, what an actor does, what a writer does, what an
Hmm.
actress does, what a cinematographer does, what John Williams does.
Yeah.
Right? It's whether the consumer would be just satisfied with a lesser version. Like AI is good with some stuff, and I do think because of the cost of these films being so outrageous, that there will have to be some things that are done with AI. But
Hmm.
uh, what I'm facing, or any artist. And in fact, there's a website that's called, I think, Have You Been Trained? And I went on, and there are images of my artwork on there that they're using in AI,
Oh, huh.
right? But the thing is that if it's anything that I drew for Marvel or DC, I don't own the rights to those images. So
Uh-huh.
they could take every one of my Superman adventure comics or covers,
Uh,
every image that I've ever drawn for Marvel and DC, and they can take that and can cut it all up. Now they have to sue. I can't sue because I don't own the rights to that artwork.
hmm
Right?
hmm
So there's a lot of gray areas or confusing areas because if you're working as a commercial artist, you surrender your rights to that material when you sign your check or you
Yeah.
sign your contract, right? I mean, right on the back of the Marvel voucher, it goes, I own everything forever in the known universe, every version you can think of, right?
hmm hmm
Um, and now the computer can scrape, this programs can scrape the internet, take all your images. What can I do? You know,
Yeah.
I don't even have the right to be able to sue them. You know,
Wow. Wow.
so a lot of people wouldn't even think about that stuff. But one of the things I guess I've always been business minded about the business of comics, about being an artist, because as a teenager growing up and reading the comics journal and the history of the business, the history of comics is basically it's not kind to most people who worked in it.
That's my
You know, Bob,
understanding. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, like Bob Kane did okay because he had a lawyer. He was smart. Siegel and Schuster did not get the same deal,
Yeah.
right? And they were and Warner Brothers was only shamed into giving them a better deal when the Superman movie, the Christopher Reeves movie came out.
hmm
Right. You don't want CBS News showing up and, here, you know, the, the blind creator of Superman, living
hmm
in a hovel, right? They don't want
Right.
that. Right. So it's we're sort of in the same spot, you know. Um, so I was very aware of the fact that uh, the business was not kind to many people.
Mm.
And the most creative era, the stuff that they're putting up on the screen, all the guys like Ditko and Kirby and people like that, um, you know, they were getting screwed in the 60s. I mean,
Mm.
supposedly one of the things that made both of them angry was that when they started making those cartoons in the 60s,
hmm
they didn't get any money out of that,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? That
hmm
Hanna-Barbera Fantastic Four cartoon I saw as a kid, or those really horrible Marvel superhero cartoons that I saw as a kid, they still weren't getting it. They didn't get $5 out of that.
Mm.
They didn't. So the business has a long history of mistreating talent,
Yeah.
promising but not delivering. The people who made money in comics were the guys in the creators in comic strips because they co-owned their property.
hmm
Right?
hmm
So if you did Brenda Starr, you owned half. You know, Charles Schultz owned Peanuts. Hal Foster owned Prince Valiant. Right?
hmm
All those artists became wealthy, far wealthier than anybody in comics. If you were in 500 to 1,000 newspapers back in the day, I mean, you were making the equivalent of making millions of dollars.
Wow. Wow.
So the comic strips was probably the only venue as a cartoonist where you could really, really do well.
Wow. Huh. Interesting things. You have so much insight. You also have a cat who is like
Right.
Seriously. Yeah.
It's like cat fetching right here. Yeah.
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 Yeah, but
Yeah.
that is so interesting. I feel like we could go on for another hour and explore, but I don't want to keep you. Um, so back around to newspaper comics, you are now doing the Phantom, uh,
And Judge Parker.
and Judge Parker. Anything that you would want listeners to know about events, spaces to connect, spaces to read more, any of those kind of places that you wanna share for
Well,
anybody out there.
you can read both on Comics Kingdom
Hmm. Hmm.
every day. I think a lot of newspapers do have uh, on their website, they do carry the strips. Um, and right now, we're probably getting close towards the end of a big 2 year storyline that Tony DePaul and I have been working on with the Phantom.
Hmm.
Uh, that is probably it's certainly the longest story in the history of the strip. That it also involved a prophecy of whether the 21st Phantom will pass away and his son will become the 22nd Phantom,
Hmm.
which is sort of ironic when you think about the fact that so the Phantom is 87 years this year. So
Wow.
if he was 20 in 1936, he would be dead.
Yep. Yep. True enough.
Right?
True
Right?
enough.
And he certainly wouldn't be wearing uh, purple spandex running around in the heat of the African jungle, right?
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things for me about doing the strip was it's the same guy. I mean, he fought Nazis. He helped Mercury astronauts in the '60s. Now he has a cell phone. His kids have been around since, I guess, well, I think Siberia retired in 99, 97, 99. So he's been retired a long time. So his kids came around sometimes in the late '80s or early '90s. So his kids would be like 40, right? Not still either late teens or early 20s. So that's one of the very interesting things about doing the comic strips is that you gradually update things,
Hmm.
but you sort of have to kind of wink at the fact that any legacy continuity strip,
Hmm.
the characters would, Mary Worth would be, she's long gone by now, right? I mean, she was an old lady already back in the day. So that's something that Tony and I would talk about. Updating technology, updating, if they're in the real world. I had same conversations with Francesco, who writes Judge Parker.
Hmm.
Um, you have to acknowledge like we had to acknowledge COVID,
Yeah.
which advanced things. So, like for a long time, Sophie and Nettie, two of the main characters of Judge Parker, were forever teenagers, or one a teenager and one like early 20s, because Nettie's a little older than Sophie. But now Sophie's in her getting ready to go to her third year of college, right? So
Hmm.
because you acknowledge COVID, which would be kind of hard to ignore in a continuity strip, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Or do you totally go into like La La Land where there's never any acknowledgement of the passing of seasons, which is very different than how Woody Wilson was the previous writer on Judge Parker. He never really acknowledged the change of seasons. We would on Christmas Day, while there was a war going on, he would always write a tribute to the troops, the veterans
Hmm.
kind of thing. but they never really talked about the advancement of years. So the the teenager stayed a teenager for 20 years,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Yeah. So it's this weird, because Judge Parker had gray streaks in his hair back in 1953.
Hmm. Hmm.
Again, he would be dead now, right? He was in his 40s or 50s in 1953. He would have passed away a while ago. So it's one of those things that you have to sort of play fast and loose with. Either you make something that's completely unrealistic,
Hmm.
but he's still using rotary phones, right?
Yeah.
And driving 1952 Buicks, or you try to update it and update the characters, update the fashions. Um, it's just one of the things that you have to deal with in a continuity strip where the characters don't age in real time, but you still have to acknowledge time because you can't
Hmm.
have people wearing like poodle hairdos from the 50s.
Yeah. Time works well in a comic strip, apparently.
Well, it's like Peter Parker. How old is Peter Parker now? I mean, he came out in 1961. He was a
Hmm.
teenager. So if he was 16 in 1960, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
He's well into his senior citizen years now, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So, just like in the Fantastic Four, there's one of the thing met the Beatles. There's that panel that Kirby drew with him wearing the Beatles wig.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So again, it's like one of the things we have to sort of concern ourselves with, um, but you can't let it totally destroy continuity by ignoring it. But
Hmm.
you still can't age people in real time.
Yeah. Yeah. And you get to pass the stories on in some way, one
Right,
way or the
right.
other.
Yeah, like Tony and I talked about it for a while, and you're never really sure like how long comic strips will last. So we were thinking like, well, traditionally, I mean, this is the same guy or Lee Falk has been writing from the beginning, right? It's the same Phantom, unlike the other Phantoms who would by this point would have been shot or stabbed or killed, and then their kid would have taken over.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know whether King Features would actually let us do that either, whether they would let us kill the 21st Phantom.
Yeah.
So we have sort of hinted at that, and then we'll sort of see how this goes. You also want to keep the strip interesting.
Hmm. Hmm.
You don't want to just have some moribund, boring, same thing. Like Gilligan's Island, where like next week some reason happens why they can't get off the island, kind of thing,
Right. Right.
right? And there's certain he's the only adventure character left besides Prince Valiant, but Prince Valiant actually has aged in Prince Valiant,
Hmm.
right? Foster started aging him right away,
Yeah.
so from the beginning he aged as the strip continued. But the Phantom didn't hasn't really aged, although he did get married and he did have kids.
Hmm.
He still looks like a very fit, I would say, like 45-year-old.
He's doing well. He's doing well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The striped underwear still fits.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you're doing that now. I'm glad you're taking that story on, and I continue to enjoy the things that I see that you post. I saw you posted today a Superman Adventures cover concept that had never surfaced or been used. So I continue to enjoy seeing your work out there when it's yours and not AI. by the way. I'll throw that out there for DC and Marvel. When it's got the human touch, I appreciate that. So continue to enjoy what you're sharing out.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Did we miss anything in the conversation that you want to make sure to share before we close out?
Well, like I said, people can follow my work on my Facebook, Mike Manley on Facebook, or Draw Manley on Instagram, or The Monster Man on Twitter. Although I'm not sure how long I stopped tweeting for a while. Now I'm kind of back a little bit, but I really
Hmm.
don't know how.
It's a
I don't.
love-hate relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm mostly on there honestly because there's friends of mine who are on there who aren't on anything else.
Hmm. Yeah.
But I've decided that I'm not going to thread or any of these other things. So eventually the same thing will happen, right? You go to a place, it's new, everybody gets on, it becomes popular, they take it public, they get a new CEO,
Hmm.
changes everything, screws everything all up.
Right.
That's the business model, right? So everybody will hop on thread or whatever. And in 2 years it'll be just as junky as every other place.
Right. Right. Yeah, I've not jumped over there yet, and I continue to be on the spaces that you mentioned. And I love curating folks like yourself that share art and positive things on social media as opposed to the contentious and the um upsetting, I guess, and things like that.
Well, one thing I learned very early on with, I guess probably back in the AOL days, no one ever changes anyone's mind on social. No
Very true.
one, no one reading one of your tweets or your post, your blog finally goes, you know what? You know,
Yeah,
you're right. I'm taking off this mask of evil, right?
that's right.
It,
That's
it
right.
never, it never happens. I like Facebook because I can post longer. I can have an interesting conversation with people.
Hmm.
Um, and I also think that most of my peer group is on there.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I'm not really interested in. I had a TikTok account, but I'm not 15. I'm not going to make some stupid video of me and my cat doing some thing. I like making
Right.
art, I like sharing art. I like talking about art, my
Yeah,
art, other people's art that I like. That's what interests me about social media. You know, I'm
yeah.
not I'm not interested in trying to generate something that nothing against 15-year-olds, but I'm not interested in doing that. So
Yeah.
uh, I find that all that, and I think that Instagram has gotten junky because of that. Right? They're
Hmm.
always all this other stuff at you. Um, in the long run, I think they just sort of tear down their own brand, their own brand.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's why I'm doing podcasts where I'm talking to comics creators and I'm not posting dance videos. I think I'm better at
Right.
this than dancing, so it works. It works.
Me too. Me too.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate the conversation.
Well,
I've kept you,
thank you for asking me to be on.
yeah, absolutely. I've kept you longer than I promised, but it's been a wonderful conversation and glad to share about your work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.